The warning lights on American democracy are flashing red, and the cause is not subtle.
Are you stupid? Are you a stupid person?
From labeling reporters' questions as stupid to shrouding a sudden presidential MRI in absolute secrecy, we are witnessing a systematic disconnection between the executive branch and public accountability. This is a calculated re-engineering of governance designed to bypass the press and Congress entirely. We are dissecting this critical erosion of checks and balances based on a comprehensive analysis of Government Accountability Office reports and constitutional precedents. Our focus begins with specific confrontations. These involved a former president and the press corps. His repeated characterization of questions as stupid became a recurring motif.
Are you stupid? Are you stupid? Are you stupid?
This wasn't merely rhetoric. It signaled a deliberate stance. It challenged the traditional role of media scrutiny. What does this signify for the flow of information? How does it impact public understanding? Next, we delve into a puzzling medical disclosure. An unexplained MRI created a vacuum of information. This absence fueled speculation. It highlighted the tension between personal privacy and public transparency. For a leader, health is not solely a private matter. It intersects with national security and decision-making capacity. What mechanisms exist for verifying such vital information? How does institutional trust erode when clarity is withheld? Finally, we turn to the escalating restrictions on immigration. These policies have reshaped borders and lives. They reflect a broader shift in national priorities. We will analyze the systemic implications. These policies test legal frameworks and international norms. They place immense strain on agencies like DHS. What are the long-term consequences for human rights and economic stability? How do these actions redefine the nation's identity? This analysis seeks to inform, not to persuade. We aim to dissect the mechanisms at play. We will trace the consequences for ordinary citizens. Our journey will reveal the interconnectedness of these events. Each episode, distinct yet linked, illustrates profound institutional stress. We are observing the system under pressure. The press briefing room often functions as a crucial pressure valve. It allows for direct public inquiry. Yet, under the previous administration, this mechanism shifted dramatically. Verbal clashes became commonplace. Reporters' questions were frequently dismissed as stupid or fake. This created a constant tension. The executive openly challenged the legitimacy of traditional news gathering. This approach aimed to delegitimize critical reporting. It sought to control the narrative directly. This strategy had a clear mechanism. It bypassed established media filters. It communicated messages unmediated. The consequence was a fragmented information landscape. Public trust in institutions, including the press, continued its decline. A 2023 Gallup poll showed only 7% of Americans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspapers. This compares to 39% in 1990. The confrontations amplified this erosion. Simultaneously, an unexplained medical event surfaced. News of an MRI, without a clear explanation, created uncertainty. The public was left to speculate. This lack of transparency around executive health is not new. However, in an era of rapid information dissemination, it becomes magnified. The mechanism of withholding information can breed distrust. It raises questions about the leader's capacity. What are the protocols for executive health disclosures? Who safeguards this vital information? Concurrently, immigration policy underwent significant transformation. Restrictions escalated, often through executive actions. These actions included changes to asylum processes. They involved increased border enforcement. These shifts tested the legal and ethical boundaries. They stressed interagency cooperation. The Department of Homeland Security faced unprecedented operational challenges. The consequence was a humanitarian crisis at the border. Families were separated. Many individuals faced prolonged detention. The system of checks and balances was continually challenged. How do these rapid policy shifts impact the judiciary's oversight role? These three distinct areas, press relations, health transparency, and immigration policy, reveal a pattern. They illustrate a deliberate straining of institutional norms. They highlight a shift in how power interacts with established systems. The landscape of communication between the executive and the press underwent a deliberate re-engineering. Traditional press conferences, once a staple became performance stages. The mechanism was direct engagement, often bypassing the press corps entirely. This allowed for an unfiltered message. The consequence was a significant shift in public perception of media roles. This strategy worked to create an us versus them dynamic. It positioned the press as an adversary, not an accountability mechanism. Consider the dynamic of an unexplained MRI. Such an event in any other context would demand immediate clarification. The absence of a detailed medical report or even a clear statement fueled uncertainty. The mechanism here is the control of information. It creates a narrative void. This vacuum is then filled by speculation. The public's right to know about a leader's health, especially one with immense power, becomes a central question. Does the private health of a public figure always remain private, or do the demands of the office necessitate transparency? The escalation of immigration restrictions presented another crucial arena. Policy changes were not merely administrative. They reflected a fundamental reinterpretation of national identity and sovereignty. The Remain in Mexico policy, for instance, altered asylum procedures. It mandated asylum seekers wait outside U.S. borders. This mechanism aimed to deter migration. Its consequence was the creation of vast, precarious, tent cities. These conditions strained humanitarian organizations. They challenged international legal obligations. The GAO has repeatedly flagged concerns regarding oversight at the border. Their reports highlight the difficulty in tracking individuals and resources. These three areas, seemingly disparate, illustrate a common thread. They show an executive willing to push institutional boundaries. They demonstrate a redefinition of accepted norms. The press confrontations challenged the Fourth Estate's function. The MRI incident tested transparency's limits. The immigration policies strained legal and ethical frameworks. Each action, in its own way, applied pressure to the existing system. The outcome was a heightened sense of institutional stress. This constant pressure reveals the resilience or fragility of democratic mechanisms. The repeated characterization of journalistic questions as stupid served a distinct purpose. It was a mechanism to undermine the very act of inquiry. This tactic aimed to reframe the relationship. The press became an opponent, not a conduit. The consequence was a chilling effect on open dialogue. It fostered a climate of antagonism. Is this a sustainable model for a healthy democracy? Does it allow citizens to make informed decisions? The episode of the unexplained MRI further illustrates this pattern. Medical information for a sitting president is inherently of public interest. The mechanism of a terse, unelaborated statement left many questions unanswered. This created a void of factual clarity. The consequence was an environment ripe for speculation and mistrust. It highlighted a systemic vulnerability. How do we ensure transparency without sacrificing privacy? Where is the line for a public servant? The escalation of immigration restrictions also demonstrates this dynamic. Policies were often introduced with little public consultation. The mechanisms involved executive orders and agency directives. These bypassed legislative processes. The consequence was rapid, far-reaching change. This left little room for public debate or judicial review. It also placed significant stress on the rule of law. The implementation of these policies, like family separations, triggered widespread condemnation. It raised fundamental questions about human dignity. The Department of Defense's law of armed conflict principles emphasized distinction and proportionality. Do these principles apply to domestic immigration enforcement? The systemic impact of these actions extends beyond immediate policy outcomes. They redefine the very boundaries of executive authority. They test the resilience of institutional checks and balances. This constant pushing of boundaries creates a new normal. It challenges the foundational principles of democratic governance. The consistent denigration of legitimate journalistic inquiry was not accidental. It was a calculated mechanism. By labeling questions as stupid, the aim was to discredit the questioner. This also diminished the value of the information sought. The consequence was a fracturing of the public's perception. It separated them from reliable sources of information. This tactic contributed to a growing skepticism. It fostered doubt in any report critical of the administration. What happens when the public can no longer distinguish fact from fiction? How does democracy function without a shared understanding of reality? The unexplained MRI served as a stark example of this information control. The public was presented with an event, but without its full context. The mechanism was the strategic deployment of ambiguity. This left room for interpretation. It allowed for the narrative to be shaped by those in power. The consequence was a loss of trust in official statements. A Pew Research Center study showed that trust in government has been steadily declining. In 1964, 77% of Americans trusted the government. By 2021, that figure had fallen to 24%. Such incidents exacerbate this trend. They highlight the fragility of institutional credibility. The escalating immigration restrictions operated on a similar principle. Policies were often enacted with limited public discourse. The mechanism involved unilateral executive action. These actions often circumvented legislative debate. The consequence was a rapid overhaul of established immigration systems. This created legal challenges and humanitarian concerns. The War Powers Resolution requires congressional consultation for military actions, yet domestic policy changes often face less scrutiny. Is there a parallel in the executive's ability to act unilaterally in domestic affairs? These actions created deep fissures in the body politic. They left many questioning the balance of power. They also left many concerned about the human cost. These events, taken together, suggest a deliberate strategy. It aimed to reshape the relationship between the executive and other societal pillars. This included the press, the public, and even the law itself. This constant pressure tests the endurance of democratic institutions. It pushes them to their very limits. The strategic dismantling of traditional press decorum created a new operating environment. Executive statements often bypassed journalistic filters entirely. This mechanism allowed for direct communication. It cultivated a direct relationship with a segment of the public. The consequence was a further polarization of media consumption. News became less about shared facts. It became more about reinforcing pre-existing beliefs. This fragmentation of information strains the common ground necessary for civic discourse. The unexplained MRI incident highlighted a critical vulnerability. The health of a leader is a matter of national security. The mechanism of minimal disclosure created an information vacuum. This vacuum was then filled by speculation and rumor. The consequence was a potential erosion of confidence in leadership stability. It raised questions about the government's transparency. How does a nation prepare for succession without clear health protocols? What are the long-term impacts of such opacity? Immigration policy also demonstrated a significant shift in approach. The executive branch pursued a strategy of deterrence. This involved robust enforcement and restrictive policies. The mechanism included building barriers and deploying military personnel. The consequence was a humanitarian crisis at the border. Families were separated, children were detained. The GAO has repeatedly identified significant challenges. These include accountability and oversight within border operations. These actions tested the very foundation of international human rights law. They also challenged domestic legal precedents. The principle of proportionality, crucial in military actions, finds echoes here. How does a nation balance security with humanitarian obligations? These instances collectively reveal a pattern. They show a deliberate pushing against institutional boundaries. This includes the press, medical transparency, and immigration law. The goal appears to be a reassertion of executive authority. This reassertion often came at the expense of traditional checks. The cumulative effect is a stress test on democratic systems. It forces a reevaluation of established norms. This constant pressure leaves citizens wondering about the future stability of their institutions. The confrontational style with the press became a hallmark. It was a mechanism to control the narrative. By labeling inconvenient questions as stupid, the administration sought to invalidate the inquiry. This created an adversarial relationship. The consequence was a decline in public trust in media institutions. Gallup polls have consistently shown this decline. Trust in mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly dropped significantly. In 1976, 72% expressed a great deal or a fair amount of trust. By 2016, this figure had fallen to 32%. This erosion impacts the very bedrock of informed citizenship. The unexplained MRI served as a tangible example of information asymmetry. The lack of detailed medical disclosure for a sitting president raised alarm. The mechanism was strategic silence. This allowed for an absence of official verifiable information. The consequence was widespread speculation. It fueled distrust in official pronouncements. This opacity about a leader's health can destabilize markets. It can also create uncertainty among allies and adversaries. What are the long-term implications of such a precedent? How does this impact future expectations of executive transparency? regarding immigration policies shifted dramatically and rapidly. The administration pursued aggressive enforcement. This included separating families at the border. The mechanism was the use of executive power. This bypassed legislative checks and balances. The consequence was a humanitarian crisis. It also generated significant legal challenges. The GAO has reported on the fiscal costs and operational challenges. These are associated with such rapid policy changes. These actions strained international human rights agreements. They also tested the limits of domestic legal frameworks. The War Powers Resolution exists to check executive military action. What mechanisms exist to prevent unilateral executive overreach in domestic policy? These combined events created a sense of institutional vulnerability. They highlighted how easily established norms can be challenged. This continuous pressure reshapes the political landscape. It demands a critical look at the resilience of our systems. The public dressing down of reporters became a recurring performance. This was a mechanism of direct narrative control. It sought to delegitimize critical voices. The consequence was a deepened chasm between the executive and the press. This fostered a climate of mistrust. It also created an echo chamber for specific narratives. A functioning democracy relies on a robust and independent press. What happens when that press is systematically undermined? The episode of the unexplained MRI introduced a layer of opacity. The mechanism was the withholding of customary health details. This left the public in the dark about a critical matter. The consequence was increased anxiety and speculation. It eroded the expectation of transparency. This raises fundamental questions about a leader's accountability. How do citizens assess fitness for office without reliable information? Is there an inherent right to know certain aspects of a public servant's health? The escalating immigration restrictions showcased a pattern of executive action. These actions often bypassed traditional legislative processes. The mechanism was the issuance of executive orders and directives. This allowed for rapid sweeping policy changes. The consequence was significant social disruption and legal challenges. The Department of Defense Law of Armed Conflict emphasizes proportionality. It stresses distinction in military operations. Do similar ethical considerations apply to domestic policy enforcement? The systemic stress on the immigration system became evident. Resources were stretched thin. Human rights organizations voiced alarm. These combined pressures reveal a dynamic shift in governance. They highlight a move towards executive dominance. This challenges the foundational principles of separation of powers. Such shifts demand careful public scrutiny. They can redefine the very nature of democratic checks and balances. The deliberate discrediting of reporters served a clear purpose. It was a mechanism to undermine critical scrutiny. By labeling questions as stupid, the intent was to shift blame. It moved from the executive to the questioner. The consequence was a public increasingly wary of traditional news sources. This widened the gap between official statements and perceived reality. How does a society make informed decisions without a trusted information pipeline? The unexplained MRI created a significant transparency deficit. The mechanism was a departure from established norms for executive health disclosures. This fostered an environment of opacity. The consequence was heightened uncertainty. This uncertainty can destabilize public confidence. It can also empower adversaries seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses. The public's right to know about a leader's health is paramount. It affects national stability. Escalating immigration restrictions often bypassed legislative consensus. The mechanism involved executive orders and administrative actions. These were implemented with minimal congressional input. The consequence was a rapid overhaul of policy. This led to significant human costs and legal battles. The War Powers Resolution exists to ensure legislative oversight of military actions. Are there comparable mechanisms strong enough for domestic executive actions? The process often prioritized speed over deliberation. This led to a system under immense strain. Reports from the Government Accountability Office (GAO) frequently highlight operational challenges. These challenges stem from hurried policy implementations. These events illustrate a pattern of executive power expansion. They show a willingness to push against the boundaries of established institutional practice. This creates a new baseline for governance. It also forces a re-evaluation of the checks and balances. What does this mean for the future health of democratic institutions? The repeated public berating of reporters established a new dynamic. This was not merely about challenging false information. It was a mechanism to sow doubt in the journalistic process itself. The consequence was a further erosion of the Fourth Estate's perceived legitimacy. Pew Research Center data consistently shows declining trust in media. This trend was amplified by such direct executive attacks. When information sources are deliberately discredited, what fills the void? The unexplained MRI represents a critical failure of transparency. The mechanism was the deliberate obfuscation of health information. This was a deviation from presidential disclosure norms. The consequence was a vacuum of verifiable facts. This vacuum was quickly filled by rumor and partisan narratives. It undermined the public's right to know. Such opacity breeds distrust. It raises questions about leadership stability. Escalating immigration restrictions were implemented with unprecedented speed. The mechanism involved broad executive authority. This often sidestepped congressional input. The consequence was a series of policies with widespread societal impact. These policies often faced immediate legal challenges. The Government Accountability Office (GAO) has highlighted operational inefficiencies. These stem from hastily enacted immigration policies. These include significant costs and implementation hurdles. Such rapid, unilateral action can strain the separation of powers. It tests the resilience of democratic institutions. The Department of Defense law of armed conflict stresses clear lines of command. It also emphasizes accountability. Are similar standards applied to domestic executive actions? The cumulative effect of these actions reshapes the institutional landscape. It leaves citizens to navigate a system under constant redefinition. The confrontational stance with the press became a predictable pattern. It was a mechanism to control the public discourse. By continuously labeling inconvenient questions as stupid, the administration aimed to devalue the inquiry itself. The consequence was a fracturing of shared reality. Public trust in media as measured by Gallup continued its downward trend. This creates an environment where objective facts struggle to gain traction. What happens when the gatekeepers of information are consistently dismissed? The unexplained MRI served as a stark example of information control. The mechanism was the deliberate lack of comprehensive medical disclosure. This broke with decades of established presidential transparency. The consequence was a surge of rumors and speculation. It left a critical gap in public understanding. This opacity can breed instability. It raises questions about the true state of executive health. How does a nation make critical judgments without full transparency from its highest office? Escalating immigration restrictions represented a significant policy shift. The mechanism involved the aggressive use of executive authority. This often bypassed the slower, more deliberative legislative process. The consequence was a rapid implementation of policies. These policies had profound humanitarian and economic impacts. The Government Accountability Office (GAO) has repeatedly documented inefficiencies. These are often linked to rapid policy changes in complex areas. The War Powers Resolution offers a check on military deployments. Yet, domestic policy changes can occur with less legislative friction. This highlights a critical imbalance. The cumulative effect of these actions reshapes the relationship between government and governed. It forces a reevaluation of the durability of institutional norms. This places immense pressure on the very foundations of democratic governance. The consistent dismissal of critical questions reshaped press interactions. It was a mechanism to control the narrative by discrediting its challengers. Calling questions stupid served as a direct attack on journalistic legitimacy. The consequence was a further polarization of information consumption. Public trust in media, already fragile, suffered further. A functioning democracy relies on diverse, credible information. How does a society hold power accountable without it? The unexplained MRI created a significant void in public knowledge. The mechanism was the unusual secrecy surrounding a leader's health. This deviated from historical presidential transparency. The consequence was heightened public anxiety and speculation. It eroded the expectation of full disclosure. This opacity impacts national security. It can be exploited by foreign adversaries. What are the long-term implications of such a precedent for future administrations? Escalating immigration restrictions were often implemented unilaterally. The mechanism was the aggressive use of executive orders. This bypassed the traditional legislative process. The consequence was immediate and widespread societal disruption. Legal challenges mounted rapidly. The Government Accountability Office (GAO) frequently reports on the fiscal impact of these rapid policy shifts. The War Powers Resolution provides a framework for military actions. Yet domestic executive actions often face fewer immediate checks. This creates an imbalance in governmental power. These actions collectively put immense stress on the system. They force a reevaluation of the durability of institutional guardrails. The careful balance of power is tested. This leaves citizens to ponder the future stability of their democratic framework. The patterns are clear: deliberate press confrontations, opaque health disclosures, and rapid executive immigration changes all follow a similar blueprint. Each action challenged established norms. Each sought to control information or bypass traditional checks. The mechanism in play is consistent: exert maximum executive power. The consequence is a system under increasing strain. Public trust, as Pew and Gallup data show, continues to erode. This creates a fertile ground for disinformation. The repeated dismissal of journalistic inquiry, often with demeaning language, served a distinct purpose. It aimed to delegitimize any critical examination. The unexplained MRI created a vacuum of essential information. It fostered an environment of speculation. Escalating immigration restrictions, often enacted through executive orders, bypassed legislative debate. This put immense pressure on the legal and humanitarian systems. Together, these actions illustrate a profound shift. They represent an expansion of executive authority. They push against the foundational principles of transparency and accountability. These events are not isolated incidents. They are interconnected gears within a larger system. They reveal how institutional stress points can be exploited. They show how public trust, once damaged, becomes difficult to repair. The implications extend far beyond any single administration. They challenge the very health of democratic governance. How resilient are our institutions to sustained pressure? How vigilant must citizens be to safeguard fundamental processes? The future of these systems, like a carefully tended garden, requires constant attention. It demands a clear understanding of the mechanisms at play. The warning is subtle, yet urgent. The erosion of norms can lead to profound, lasting change.